entitled A Writer Looks at 20th Century History, is being co-sponsored by the Program on Constitutional Government and the Kennedy School's Institute of Politics. A member of the Committee on Social Thought at the University of Chicago, Mr. Bello is one of this country's most profound and most eloquent writers. In addition to the Nobel Prize for Literature, which he received in 1976, he has won a Pulitzer Prize and an unparalleled 3 National Book Awards for fiction. We are indeed fortunate to have Mr. Bello with us this evening. Introducing Mr. Bello will be Harvey C. Mansfield, Jr., Frank G. Thompson Professor of Government at Harvard, and I'm pleased to say a close colleague of mine in the Harvard's Department of Government. Harvey?
Thank you, Dean Putnam. Actually, I wasn't going to say much more because Saul Bellow needs no introduction to any cultivated or even literate audience in the world. His 2 most recent books are The Theft and The Bella Rosa Connection. Not everyone knows that he's a professor at the University of Chicago in the Committee on Social Thought, so I'll mention that. Perhaps, on the other hand, we need to be introduced to Saul Bellow. We're Harvard students of all ages who've come to see and hear an author whom we vastly admire, Saul Bellow.
Thank you very much, Dean. Thank you, Mr. Mansfield. Ladies and gentlemen, I understand tonight's format is as follows, that I will give a talk of about 40 minutes, and then to the point of exhaustion I will answer some questions from the audience. When I was pressed to give a title for this talk, I gave it off the top of my head. So I don't really know what to call it. I think you'll find as you listen to me that it's mostly on the double subject of distraction and attention. There's a difference also, always that the writers know between a text to be read and a text to be heard. Text to be read can be much more dense. A text to be heard has to be a little more loosely worked and open. I'm afraid, as I look through this speech this afternoon, that it was meant more for readers than hearers. But anyhow, you paid your money and you get your choice. Some of my high school English teachers had us commit poems to memory, and it's thanks to them that more than 60 years ago I memorized long passages from Coleridge's The Ancient Mariner. The mariner, you will remember, stops a guest on his way to a wedding and compels him to listen to his story. The offended guest cries, "Hold off, unhand me, graybeard loon. Eftsoons," I always loved the word eftsoons, "eftsoons his hand dropped he. He holds him with his glittering eye," Coleridge wrote. The feast is set. Can you all hear me? The feast, no? Okay. I'm glad we've done. Can you hear me now? Okay, fine. Want me to start over again? He holds him with his glittering eye, Coleridge wrote. The feast is set. The musicians are already playing. The bride is like a rose, but the mariner will not release his listener. The wedding guest, he beat his breast, but he could not choose but hear. When I think of the power of a tale teller to compel attention, I often recall these lines. For it isn't every wedding feast that mariners, ancient or modern, be they ever so driven or compelling, can keep you from. My late friend Delmore Schwartz wrote a book called The World is a Wedding. He was being fanciful, ironical, for our present world, considered as a wedding, would be very tough competition for an inspired mariner, however hypnotic his eye. The world of country weddings is very different from the one we now know. Nearer the latter, despite a gap of several centuries, is the world of Hamlet. Absent thee from felicity a while, says Hamlet to Horatio, and in this harsh world draw thy breath in pain to tell my story. Well, Horatio, judging from centuries of controversy over the interpretation of Hamlet's story, wouldn't have had an easy time of it. It's no simple matter to get people to listen, and, if they do listen, to make them heed, or, finally, to lead them to agree. These are some of the difficulties at the heart of the contemporary condition, for by now we have learned to hear and not to hear, to be present and absent at the same time. There are hundreds of ways of talking about this modern condition. Terms like the new urban universe, a transformation of human consciousness. Marx, Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, and their followers or interpreters have given us a vocabulary for these modern or postmodern or post-postmodern phenomena. I prefer to avoid using any of the going terms and keep to the point of view of a writer, a novelist. Writers instinctively duck away from terms like alienation, the last man, the rebellion of the masses, because these limit their personal examination of human affairs. A writer is apt to treat such formulations as interesting, but not necessarily conclusive or forever binding. In fact, such formulations tend to get in his way. They are distracting, and distraction is the word by which I designate the main difficulty. We are in an unbearable state of distraction. If you are in a trade that depends on your ability to obtain and hold attention, distraction is the hostile condition, massive and worldwide, you are called upon to overcome. Distraction, the great noise, as I sometimes think of it, is a barrier through which your writer or painter or musician or thinker must force a way. Distraction is a term for the ordeal of getting people to attend to what is essential. And attention is universally solicited. The mental space everybody is apparently driven to penetrate is our own mental space. A writer, therefore, finds himself competing not so much with other writers as with all the great social and political powers which continually claim a portion of our minds. If I had to list the great attention getters of my own time, I would begin with names like Hitler, Stalin, Churchill, and FDR. These were men who also contributed significantly to the forces of distraction that had the world reeling in the 30s and 40s and after. During those decades, behaving oddly because I had decided to be a writer, my attention was claimed primarily by Joyce, Proust, Kafka, and earlier classics. as between Hitler and Molly Bloom, both monologists, it was Hitler who was incomparably more influential. And my own preference for Molly didn't exactly put me into the mainstream. But most minds were stormed by the world crisis, and this crisis can be viewed as the Big Bang that launched the expanding mass of distraction hanging over us now and forever drawing us into itself. Distraction is in large part the form assumed by our modern mental life. Vast enterprises live on our attention, and they contrive to get it more by foul means than fair. The world crisis aforementioned got access to our attention by hitting us on the head with its great issues: war, revolution, tyranny, pain, death, and Hitler's immediate threat to freedom. The political and social life of the present moment is not so clearly and dramatically thematic as it was during World War II. The names of the enterprises that force themselves upon us will not surprise you in the least. You will say, "What? Them again?" But that too is significant. George Orwell warned us some time ago, these are his own words, "We have now sunk to a depth at which the restatement of the obvious is the first duty of civilized men." The obvious is that all minds are drawn toward a common field, which is, as far as that goes, humanly proper. To enumerate the forces that draw it toward this common field is heavy work and will lead us even deeper into the obvious. For my purpose, it is enough to point out that this common field is in an extraordinary state of excitement, of agitation. Now, having begun with Coleridge, and this is consistent with the literary approach I'm taking, I turn to his friend Wordsworth to remind you of Wordsworth's famous statement that poetry comes from emotion recollected in tranquility. But in this vast common field of agitation, I suggest, the mind has to fly very far to find a tranquil perch. And I suggest further that emotion too becomes unstable where distraction is so widespread. I suggest even that so vast a common field diminishes the importance of the human units that fill it up, that the very instability of their emotions makes them doubt their own human weight. The career of mankind as entertainment, the earthly paradise as an assortment of thrills, history as a super-sensational production in which we are both participants and audience. That is sometimes what an American perspective suggests. At the same time, and I know I'm being slow to leave the obvious, all the large social phenomena express themselves in the inexhaustible claims they make. Enterprises holding on to their share of the market press us hard. They pitch us day and night. Our middle-class mailboxes are stuffed with junk mail, brochures in glossy color, and every day we are pushed to buy cars, cosmetics, health pills, painkillers, sleep remedies, invited to bank, to invest, to relieve our itching, to subscribe to publications, to join clubs, to take holidays abroad, to buy laptop computers. All this is so familiar that I'm a bit ashamed to mention it. Clearly, I am not interested here in marketing and consumerism. My justification is that I am accumulating evidence for an interpretation of the effects of these business activities and other activities on our mental life and culture. So I shall labor the obvious a little longer and look very briefly at the newspapers and the television networks. A professor in California, who seems to have nothing better to do than this, a professor in California has estimated that on an average weekday, the New York Times contains more information than any contemporary of Shakespeare would have acquired in a lifetime. I am ready to believe that this is more or less true, although I suspect that the information of an educated Elizabethan was better integrated than that of the Times reader. And I can't imagine that anybody would want to read every single page of a daily newspaper and go through it from end to end. But I grant that an obsessive reader might, if he were retired or lying in the hospital or in despair, do just that. With the Sunday Times, it would be totally impossible. It would, if you could do it, constipate your intelligence for a long time to come. So we must assume that the paper is read selectively, but the principles of selection, if they were well-founded, would cast doubts on the facts as reported and raise questions about the policies of the paper, the integrity of the reporters, and the views of its commentators and columnists. There are people who believe that the plethora of information contained in the Times or any other newspaper or news magazines has little real value. Indeed, there are dependable observers who hold that their newspapers do not give Americans any true picture of the world. At most, they only disclose the version of the world being offered to the public. To choose a couple of outrageous examples, did the Times accurately report on Russia in the days of Walter Duranty? Or did it dependably report Vietnam in the stories sent by Harrison Salisbury? The most the print media can do is at best inadequate. And now, more unavoidable spadework in the obvious, the television screen. People are understandably bored by discussions of TV. I dislike them too. But I shan't be asking this time what ought to be done about lust and violence on the tube. We can't do more with these than Milton did with Belial in hell. Than whom a spirit more lewd fell not from heaven, or more gross to love vice for itself. The most we can say is that Milton's attack did Belial no great harm, and that more people still watch the set, obviously, than read Paradise Lost. I am concerned in this part of my talk with the overall influence of TV on the Americans, not because of what it induces them to buy, but because it focuses them on nothing in particular. It brings solitaries into an environment of millions. It allows them to participate in the life of a whole country. It draws the atomized consciousness back to the whole, not to a community, but to the beckoning suggestion of a community. It leads us by the magnetism of the promise of unity into wild diversity. And perhaps what we actually look to it for is distraction in the form of reality. Every day we reel about in a world that resembles the real world, recognizable screen images of that world increase the general disorder. Pointless but intense excitement holds us. The stimulant is powerful but short-lived. The screen lights up, we hear threatening music. We see a rapist killer opening a woman's bedroom door. She escapes, runs to the kitchen for a knife. We have a pursuit through night streets, shots, a death, a fall from a roof or a bridge. Then, time is up. We go on to another drama. Now we are in a courtroom or in a church, or listening to the diabolical schemes of a big-time evildoer, or identifying a body in the morgue. And then, just as suddenly, we flash away to a cooking lesson, or we are on the veldt with animals, or with Lenin among the revolutionary masses. Next, abortions, or flag burnings, or the school crisis, or the end of communism in Europe. And we have remote control switches to permit us to jump back and forth and mix up beginnings, middles, and ends, so nothing happens in any sort of order. This, I understand, is a game quite popular with adolescents these days. I go by a recent statistical survey. And it is a form, seemingly, of relatively harmless mischief. But mastery belongs to the holder of the remote control switch, and the act of switching may be understood as an assertion of independence or superiority or ultimate control. Actually, it perhaps amounts to a declaration of autonomy, as if, in the end, an individual were declaring that he is not among those who will really be affected by anything. Declaring not merely that the networks will never get him, but that he is free from all influence, that he leads a sovereign existence in himself. Supremely immune, he is the gingerbread man nobody can catch, but of course there is always the ultimate fox waiting around the corner. Distraction catches us all in the end and makes mental mincemeat of us. Each separate intelligence at its separate command post is aware that measures must be taken to protect its sovereignty. To this autonomous sovereign, distraction is very possibly a game, a delicious game. It can organize any amount of randomness or inconsequence, anything you throw at it. I have sometimes asked myself why the daily crossword puzzle in the Times is on the book page. It's there so that minds full of ill-assorted and superfluous knowledge can test themselves by remembering facts they had no need to know in the first place. And it is the educated reader who is likeliest to turn to the book review and then divert himself with the puzzle. This is where our minds play by releasing insignificant bits of information held more or less by our brain cells. Some obviously are proud of their ability to put it all together in spite of the turbulence that surrounds us. I wrote long ago in Herzog, what this country needs is a good 5-cent synthesis. But what of those who can't come up with a synthesis at any price? Some are flooded and capsize by inconsequence, disequilibrium, delirium. In recent days, trying to make sense of TV discussions of the drug problem, it has occurred to me that television in itself may be driving people to smoke crack or take cocaine. The individual sovereignty or mastery game is becoming impossible, and the defeated players seek ultimate separation in narcotics. The confluence in recent weeks of two of the two press and TV topics, drugs and education, suggest a similarity and possibly even an identity of causes. Teach us to care and not to care. Teach us to sit still, T.S. Eliot wrote. And I've always read these lines as a prayer for poise under threat of frenzy and dissolution. Eliot also said, half-jokingly, that he couldn't bear to read the papers anymore. They are too exciting. I must confess that I haven't yet kicked the habit, and like millions of others, I need my daily fix. I feel that to be out of touch, to withdraw, would beach me and leave me high and dry. I began to follow the news while I was a Chicago schoolboy in the late 20s, and thus I have had plenty of time to think about the nature of this monster, the press. In justice to the monster, the events we had to follow were only quasi-assimilable. The First World War was already humanly indigestible. Then the second was heaped upon the first, and taken together, they were totally beyond our power as attentive readers or attentive persons to take in. In Antony and Cleopatra, Shakespeare's soothsayer says, "In nature's book of infinite mysteries, a little I can read." Well, the media with their mysterious technology can teach us to read very little. They themselves are part of the excitement they generate. They can bring no light to the enormities they report. But even in racking our nerves, they seem to be meeting a wide and even universal demand. For an appetite for abominations is discernible. We can't seem to get enough of them. Political assassinations, Ethiopian famines, hostage-taking, planes exploding in flight, drug wars, cities in anarchy, Cambodian genocides, the fate of the boat people, Chinese soldiers shooting into crowds. The events themselves are not, of course, the fault of the media, although the media do at times play a part in the events, for they can be manipulated by terrorists or by governments and seduced into spreading disinformation and propaganda. And since these terrible events are presented also as entertainment, it must give way to the major concerns of the networks. Therefore, by a medium preoccupied with entertainment, they can't be dwelt upon for too long. They are quickly used up. What is the average duration of a disaster? What is the rate of turnover for government scandals or Wall Street crimes? Who can still remember the Pentagon Papers? When they have had their moment, the scandals must go. We are not asked or encouraged to extract any meaning from them, and we can't expect the media to educate the public by following up on these stories. It is observable also that not every horror can find a place in the horror gallery. In 1932-33, Stalin decided that he must destroy the Ukrainians. His agents seized everything edible and took it away. There were, at a minimum, 7 million deaths. Some estimates go as high as 15 million. All this I am reliably told, affirmed by research conducted here in Harvard University's Ukrainian Studies program. Reports of this famine were denied by Walter Duranty of the New York Times in 1932-33. Since our principal paper of record did not report this genocide, it has no place in the American horror gallery. Attempts have been made to install it there, but our media have, for the most part, balked these attempts. Thus, according to an article I read not long ago, a documentary on this mass murder was rejected by most of the public television stations in the country. When the film was shown at the New York Film Festival, it was criticized by Vincent Canby of the Times as, quote, frankly biased, end quote. The author of the aforementioned article, Mr. Peter Paluch, asks why it was that Moscow was able, quote, to muzzle the Western media, enthrall Western intellectuals, and entrance Western governments. For half a century, the story remained entombed. Then a major university study and an award-winning film exposed the genocide and its cover-up, and the U.S. media do not respond. Why? Mr. Paluch suggests several powerful answers to this question. One answer I would give is that this crime is already 50 years old. What are we going to do with a 50-year-old crime, even of these dimensions? Relations between superpowers are improving besides, so the papers want no truck with an old genocide for this reason too. So the Ukrainian famine has no place in the media's information plus entertainment plus public policy version of 20th century history. One possible explanation is that the public agitation level is already very high. So what would everybody do with yet another horrible crime? What is the point of inscribing the Ukrainian Holocaust on the continually melting surface of public memory? Later generations will perhaps want to study the historical record. I'm not sure that we can do much with it. But the advertising industry, speaking today of 30-second bites and 15-second bites, reminds me often of the beautiful naked maidens Candide sees in the South American forest. The girls run shrieking from monkeys who are biting their behinds. Simple Candide saves them. He shoots the monkeys only to learn that they were the girls' lovers. Maybe we feel the same way about the bites of television. Where there are few alternatives or none visible, we have a tendency to accept perversities. To put it another way, because we can't beat distraction, we are inclined to join it. And distraction is actually addictive, for a state of dispersed attention has attractions of its own. I have banged my way through these woods like a game beater, trying to flesh out some insights. The woods are all too familiar at this hour of our century. It isn't new ground that is lacking, but understanding of the old and feeling comprehension rather than analytical terms. We have plenty of such terms. Informed by all occasions, I pick up a copy of the Threepenny Review, and on a page headed Miscellany, what else? I find some excellent remarks on our subject by a man named Leonard Michaels. He says, "What conservatives, feminists, Marxists, and other contemporary thinkers have in common is that value has fled the human particular. If this is true, we have been abandoned to the allure of non-specific possibility or the thrill of infinite novelty." Leading thinkers have been examining this subject for quite a long time. If I were a student confronting the topic in an exam paper, I might handily begin with Dostoevsky's universal human anthill from the Brothers Karamazov. The anthill was what Dostoevsky threatened us with if we abandoned freedom and organized society on collective socialist lines. But who ever heard of ants whose hills were built not for work and procreation, but for comfort and entertainment, and whose principal aim was to be thrilled by never-ending novelties? From Dostoevsky, my imaginary exam taker, writing as fast as he can, might pass to Nietzsche's essay on history and the victory of the historical perspective over all other perspectives. The modern age observes only becoming, Nietzsche tells us, and ignores the being element of the eternal, so that man is plunged into that infinite sea of shimmering waves, the sea of known becoming. If only men could live in that sea, wrote Nietzsche. But the basis of man's security and peace is in the unhistorical or the suprahistorical, so that as matters stand, perpetual becoming preys on us like a deadly sickness. To this, the student, running full tilt to the end of his blue book, might append the views of Heidegger, the author of many books on Nietzsche, who wrote that the modern age gives us a full display of the groundlessness and nullity of inauthentic being. And maybe my hypothetical whiz kid would conclude with a reference to Plato's cave, where all that men are able to see are distorted shadows of the real. I now turn to the inevitable question: what special concern do writers have with this problem, the problem of distraction? Why should a writer, qua writer, bother his head about it at all? Why should he go so far even as to give a philosophical resume of it? If the streets of Chicago were safe at night, I shouldn't be straying into the works of these formidable philosophers. But I keep indoors after dark and read books I have no business to be reading. And am I then seeking order or more distraction? A writer, of course, is no less exposed to distraction than the public. He may even be more distractible than others because he has generally been trained in receptivity. Try to be one of those people on whom nothing is lost, was what Henry James said to would-be writers. In my youth, I was persuaded by James, almost persuaded, but I came to think that this was harmful advice or unnecessary, for if you are a writer by temperament, it is because you are a born noticer, and given the mass of particulars intentionally released and calculated to impose themselves on our minds, you will be more clear-headed and happy if you are armored against them. Moreover, the writer's desire for an attentive reader makes him attentive, perhaps as a sort of sympathetic magic unconsciously practiced. For, as a writer, he must be able to pierce through distractions and to seize the attention of readers for whom it is a positive torment to focus on almost anything, but to focus on, of all things, mere stories, fictions. Incomparably great resources of revolutionary technology pour out a bewildering volume of data, of equivocal suggestions, of stimuli. Their combined power is greater than any conceivable culture or tradition is, and this is especially true in the USA. In a television survey of American cities, which I took in the other night, ranked in order of desirability under 9 criteria, art is criterion number 7. But anything can be classed as art, as I learned from watching this program, from museums and symphony orchestras to jazz joints, restaurants, and fashion shows. Art, however, is my primary concern. Art in a sense that has nothing whatever to do with what the media, printed or visual, refer to as art, or even with art as described by educational institutions, especially in centers of higher learning. I sometimes think higher confusion would be more like the truth. Must art, in the sense I give it, struggle with distraction or compete with the forces that generate and sustain distraction? That's an impossible idea. Art should, it must, bypass these, as in other ages it bypassed priesthoods, monarchies, despotisms, wars, ideologies, Weltanschauungen, etc. Some of you will be saying, we have heard the speaker describe an atrocious condition. Well, what does he propose to do about it? I propose absolutely nothing. Description is my only task. The problems raised are psychological, religious, they are heavily political. If we were not a media public led by media politicians, the volume of distractions might somewhat diminish. And it is not for writers or painters to save civilization, and it's a vulgar error to suppose that they can or should do anything but what they do best. The mariner keeps the guest from the distractions of the wedding. He holds him with his glittering eye. The wedding guest listens, despite himself, and waking next morning, he is a sadder and a wiser man. This may be taken as a model for the power of the poet, if we bear in mind the difference between the English countryside of the dawning 19th century and, for deep contrast, places like Detroit and New York City. No, the writer cannot make the sun of distraction stand still, nor part its seas, nor strike the rock till it yield water. But he can, in certain cases, come between the madly distracted and their distractions. He does this by opening another world to them. For the work of art is the creation of a new world. When you open a novel, and I mean, of course, the real thing, and not the work of yet another exploitative distractor, you enter into a state of intimacy with someone. The reader hears a voice, or more significantly, an individual tone that runs under the words. This tone he will identify not so much by a name, the name of an author, but as a distinct human quality. It comes, perhaps, from beneath the breastbone. It is, if you like, as much musical as it is verbal. It is the characteristic signature of a person, of a soul, if you prefer, and not of an ego. The moment of perfect attention evoked by an artist can put a stop to the oscillations of consciousness. And what you always intuited about the external world, at last, through him, may become a reality. Then a kind of stillness descends upon the absorbed reader. This may happen in very odd circumstances. It happened to me after Raskolnikov, in Crime and Punishment, having murdered the old woman, begins to examine the objects in her apartment with extraordinary clarity and vividness and calm. The more the writer succeeds, the more intransitive the attention of the reader becomes. Then diversity is shaped into unity, and this, according to teachings I absorbed very early in life, is what art does. What we are led to consider next is the power of the artist to produce such a state in a consciousness so fragmented. If you accept my premise about the extent of fragmentation and distraction, you will agree that this takes some doing. And there are writers who have expressly set themselves to bring or wring art out of such anarchy. In a novel like Flaubert's Sentimental Education, for instance, the life of Frédéric Moreau is sheer distraction and contingency. A young man about town with some money, he is too trivially distracted by women, by legacies, by clothing, by intrigues, by the art world, to take much notice of the revolution of 1848, of the birth of his own child, or of the rapid passing of his youth. Nothing of consequence happens to him. the love of his life amounts to nothing, and he is shunted from diversion to diversion, and will at last be shunted out of life altogether. But then this book does not achieve the stillness and intransitive attention one looks for. In this brilliant book, the victory is awarded to brilliance itself, to the way things are. But the way things are is unbrilliant. In Proust, the artist's own knowledge of the world is tested against the principal public crises that he knew, the Dreyfus case and the Great War. These are treated on his own terms, the terms of a very great artist, following an independent thematic path. The war, however great and tragic, does not have absolute power to distract him from his objectives. He can blend war with his objectives. Thus, he tells us, for instance, how Madame Verdurin picks up the morning paper at breakfast and reads of the Marne or the Battle of Verdun as she sips her coffee. She has made certain, by the way, that the quality of her croissants does not decline even in wartime. Nothing is lost on Proust as he makes his way in a world curious and disjunctive, arbitrary, anarchic. Its contingencies threaten his personal vision of it, a vision with its own colors, odors, forms, and illuminations. He observes persons and events through an atmosphere comprised of past impressions and associations, and this continually increasing body, dense with mixed recollections and understandings, is what he works with. It works of itself in the present. In his own words, instead of obliterating the present, we can continue to be aware of it if we can retain the sense of our own identity, and at the same time live fully in that moment which we had for so long believed to be no more. Then and only then we are at last in possession of lost time. I have few opinions worth mentioning on Proust's theories of time and memory. I see, however, that he succeeded in preserving himself as himself in full possession of his soul and with a true, not a frantically assertive, half-demented, sovereign consciousness, such as we see everywhere today. And this is not an aesthetic sanctuary. Sanctuary is sought only by those who are in flight pell-mell from the horrors of distraction. One can see that for an artist it would be helpful in facing the modern world to have an extraordinary self-confidence, the confidence, say, of an aristocrat or a boyar, dismissing modern vulgarity and confusions of judgment and taste, and impervious to the furies of distraction. Some people, even now, have done it. I envy them. But every day I find myself again fighting weaknesses in the face of distraction that re-emerge as often as they are conquered. A writer like me is the child of this democratic confusion, both liberating and enslaving, to which we, most of us, owe so much, both the privileges and the deformities. From this common ground, we emerge like tubers with soil on our tops that we can never get rid of. I put it to you as I often put it to myself, that the crisis we are living through is in large measure a mental one. In itself, this hardly seems to be news, but its obviousness may be deceptive. What I am getting at is that for long ages, few people were called upon to think for themselves. They had knowledge, they had learned to perform tasks. Perhaps it's not too much to say that their hands thought for them. But the other thought, higher thought, was reserved for prophets, priests, philosophers, lawmakers, scholars. Democracy has, however, opened thinking to everybody, or imposed it upon everybody. And perhaps we are, from an evolutionary standpoint, in a very early stage of this development. A population with a mental life like ours must be something new in world history. We are, to an unusual degree, autonomous. We have a great range of judgments to make, which nobody else has the authority or the desire to make for us. And this leaves us open to distraction, to what Nietzsche calls endless becoming with no stability in sight. Now a word about ourselves. Educated people often appear to believe that they have the mental life of our species well in hand. Some time ago, I stopped taking comfort in this reassuring belief. I had been approached to write an introduction to Ortega's Revolt or Rebellion of the Masses, a book for which I once had a certain respect. Reading again Ortega's description of the mass man, I began to change my opinion. One characteristic of the mass man, so Ortega argues, is that he is not able to distinguish between natural and man-made resources. Water running from a tap he takes to be no different in his thoughtlessness from water in a spring. Light is light, whether it be the light of open spaces or the light that shines when we press a switch. Cleverer, abler minds understand the difference between the two sources of light, water, or other common, even free commodities. But what do these abler minds really know about the jet engines they fly all over the earth in, the telephones over which they discuss matters with their friends, the word processors on which they write letters? Nearer to home, what do I really know about what happens within my own body? Actually, I know very little. I depend on physiologists to know for me, and these depend on physicists for their knowledge of light, and both take their views on water from the chemist. But what we settle for is that for science, all of this, not yet, but ultimately, is knowable. Therefore, the difference between the mass man and the more fully conscious one is not one of knowledge, but is rather based on some confidence that everything can be known, that those competent to know are available, and that if any one of us cared to bone up on these subjects for a period of years, such a person, an educated man, could find out what the operative principles or techniques are behind, say, the manufacture of atomic warheads. But in effect, we do not know, and never will know, the technologies on which we rely. Instead of knowing, we assume knowability. A word like metabolism is not knowledge. It may be rather a sign of the pride we take in having everything under mental control. Allow me to suggest, therefore, that while we arrange to blame the mass man for his confusion of man-made with natural, all that we really have to show for ourselves is a vocabulary of approximate comprehension, and this is a very poor support for our claims to knowledge. One might therefore assert, with the support of considerable evidence, that we are by and large still in a primitive condition, but at the same time full of a curious cognitive pride. I suggest this, the above, the foregoing, as the very lightest sketch of a horizon on the devouring ocean of becoming, that is, distraction. Civilized man, said Nietzsche a century ago, had become a mere concept factory. What he meant was that by our mental busyness, which makes us so happy, we have produced a glut of knowledge, resembling seemingly informative data. In so doing, I add on my own, we have dangerously undermined and depleted our power to attend, really, to give our attention to anything. There still is art, although much discredited and polluted by its present practitioners, to attract and hold our desperately distracted minds. Thank you.
Well, to ask a question, you must take possession of a microphone, temporary possession. And you, sir, are you capable of a brief and snappy question?
Yes. The writer Harold Brodkey has said that if he could start over, he might go into TV because of the greater social impact. It seems that you would disagree with that, but I was wondering what would you recommend for a prospective writer to do?
Well, the first thing I should say about prospective writers is that I feel very sorry for them all. At the same time, I feel that they have are involved in a heroic struggle, which very few people are in a position to wage on any front. So it's both a very bad thing and a very good thing. I mean, I expect there's not as many avenues open to a young writer now as there were when I was younger. Nobody much cared what we were doing during the Depression. We were all over the place, living in Greenwich Village, and it only cost $1,200 a year to be poor, and there were a great many journals publishing, and everything was going very well. I don't know whether did Brodsky really say that he would transfer his to television if he could? Why? Because he could reach more people, but with what?
Yeah, he did say that. He just said the social impact of people who write 30-something, things like that, is great, and even though they're not Tolstoy, they have that regret, but he has his own regrets for doing what he did.
Well, Tolstoy already existed. If he can't help them by being read on television, I don't know what Brodsky expects to do. I know that's not a very satisfactory answer. I know that. But you don't have to ask me any questions, you know.
Well, I have a statement which that I was heartened when I learned that Albert Einstein spent his last years avidly reading the newspaper. I wanted to ask two quick questions. The first.
How about one quick question? Why
All right.
two? Why two? Why don't you press them together? We haven't got much time.
I don't know if I can link them together.
Why don't you speak into the mic?
Because it's having this problem with it, apparently. Okay, so I'll go with the first, which is, having grown up in an era of anti-communism where the lies and the distortions and the blind spots were of a very different order, I wonder why you, in selecting an example of that sort of thing, single out Duranty's role in the covering up of the Ukrainian situation and leave out other fine examples.
The death of 7 or 8 million people is a fairly significant thing to mention?
I don't dispute that. I'm wondering why
You mean you're asking for me to come up with an equal capitalist crime?
I'm wondering.
Well, I could cite the Great War which I think was a terrible disaster. It's not that I'm not willing to do it. It's just that the other guys have been doing more of it.
I was wondering why you singled that out.
Because I couldn't find one in Montana, so I found one in the Ukraine.
I guess it just seemed to bespeak more of a political agenda in your presentation than you seem to suggest.
Well, you think I have a secret mission to spread subversive doctrines? Is that what you're saying?
Hardly.
I don't see anything subversive in my speech.
No,
And I did attack capitalist television, didn't I?
Well, I don't know if I would use that terminology. But anyway.
Okay. Next. And why did Einstein read the newspaper? It's because he neglected it for too many years before. He was trying to catch up, and it was too late. He might have read it while Hitler was coming to power. Would have been an interesting time to follow the papers. Yeah, but if the papers don't tell you what's really going on, how are you? You only imagine that you're socially engaged. You have the emotions of being socially engaged, but not much substance. And mind you, I'm arguing against myself because I'm a self-confessed addict to newspapers. Only I don't like to be deceived, even by my own addiction.
Discussion of distraction reminded me of Augie March and the fact that he spends his youth reading all the great classics, then runs down to Mexico, even winds up running into Trotsky. And when I read that book, I was struck that you yourself must have spent quite a bit of time reading the great classics for no apparent purpose, perhaps even going down to Mexico, perhaps even running into Leon Trotsky, I hope. It seems to me that the novelist must be quite distracted before he can then sit down and distill it for the rest of us to have some peace. Is that true?
Oh, I didn't say that distraction was distraction is just diversity or the many. It's only a question of the one being drowned by the many. Oh, it is not only, it is a question. Yes, of course I read all these books. There really wasn't too much to do. I mean, there were not so many. We didn't even have a radio in the house when I was a kid. A lot of fun.
Having shown or tried to demonstrate that reading the newspapers and watching the television are not very good ways of becoming informed about the true picture of reality, what is the person who does wish to be informed and abreast of what is important, what resources does that person have, or is that essentially a hopeless task in the fragmented, hyperkinetic, distracting world that you've stressed?
Well, I will never know as much as we need to know about any of these things, but there are serious ways of going about it. I mean, you can educate yourself. That's really what I'm arguing for, saying that you must, in the face of all this, find some way to educate yourself. Thank God, the sources are there, the books are there, even some teachers are there. Something can be done about it. But if you try to live as most people do, in this increasingly jazzed up environment of distraction, you're not going to understand anything. I mean, there won't be any center left to grasp any of these things. I think that's an important part of what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that there is a certain dissolution of the self indicated and reflected in the volume of distractions.
Yes, since we are standing and listening to you in the middle of the university, what would you say is the role of the university in either the source of distraction or possibly as a harbor from its sources?
Well, I once got a piece of advice from a very intelligent man, something like this. He said, he was talking about himself, and he said, I try to concentrate on a given number of subjects or themes. I try not to go beyond them. It's as though I had several strings and I were dipping them in the mother fluid from which crystals come. And I have a variety of mother fluids, several basins around the place, and I go and dip my strings in these various fluids, and by I begin to see something crystallizing on the string. That is to say, there has to be some way to limit and to hold possession of your own mind, and that's what a university should be leading you to, it seems to me. I'm getting a little hoarse and tired, so I'll take one more question before I become ill-natured.
Mr. Bellow, I'm moved by your naming the situation we're in as a situation of distraction. It seems it's exactly the right name. I think it's important to name it. I think when we know the right name, we can start to relate to the situation we're in. When you talk about value having fled the human particular, I couldn't agree with you more. And I wonder whether our urgent need to be distracted has to do with the fear of really being inside the individual body that I live in. Because the body is the abode of death. If I fully accept being inside this this life, this individual viewpoint, then I have to make some peace with my own death. All around us we have a terrific mechanism for fleeing that basic human knowledge. I have some experience of a social movement which, in trying to get people to slow their minds down, has a little motto that goes, keep your head where your feet are, or sometimes keep your head where your hands are. And I don't know whether a series of individual decisions to do that on the basis of you and I and those in this room will count, but I suspect it might.
Well, I'm very heartened by what you say. Thank you very much. I agree with most of what you said. I'm not sure. Well, I am sure. Yeah, I agree with most of what you said. It is true that this distraction helps or encourages people to flee from the internal disorder that they try to endure, and that it's even a kind of image of this internal disorder and confirms the fact that there is nothing but disorder, nothing but inconsequence around us. I think that's absolutely true. One last thing. I remember having a conversation once with Robert Frost. He asked me whether I had ever taken a speed reading course. I said, certainly not. He said, well, you're an exception then, like me. People are trying to read faster and faster. I'm trying to read slower and slower. So I'll leave you with that. Thank you very much.